In just 72 hours, one black congresswoman went from public disgrace to uncovering a $2.7 million judicial cover-up. The headline said she was finished. The court said she didn't belong. And the system? It had already written her out of the story. But what happened next didn't just shake the courtroom. It cracked something far older, far deeper than any verdict ever could. Because when Jasmine Crockett stood before a Supreme Court justice who wasn't supposed to be there, she didn't come to beg for her name back. She came with documents, with silence sharpened by truth, and a question no one in power could answer. How does a woman they tried to humiliate, disqualify, erase, become the one who exposes what 20 years of oversight missed? This isn't a story about revenge. It's about a reckoning that started with a whisper and ended in a roar. And the moment you'll never forget didn't begin with a speech. It began with a summons. At exactly 6:13 a.m. on a rainy morning in Washington, D.C., a message arrived on Jasmine Crockett's phone that felt less like due process and more like a warning shot. It was still dark over Washington when Jasmine Crockett's phone buzzed, a low, urgent vibration that slipped through the silence of her apartment like an uninvited whisper. 6:13 a.m. The screen lit up with 5 cold words. You are hereby summoned. No context, no case number, no attorney CC'd. Just a court location, a time, and a directive that felt more like a threat than a notice. The summons was for 9 a.m., less than 3 hours from now. And it wasn't just any court. It was the D.C. Federal Court of Appeals, a place where reputations are buried, not argued for. She stared at the message for a long second, her coffee still untouched on the windowsill. Outside, rain traced slow lines down the glass, as if the city itself were unsure about what was coming. Jasmine had faced down scandal before. Dirty edits on her words, doctored headlines, orchestrated smear campaigns. But this felt different, colder, like something had already been decided, and they just needed her signature on the script. There was no legal counsel listed, no complaint summary, just her name, a room number, and a deadline. Her instincts, honed from years defending people the system forgot, told her this wasn't a court date. It was a setup, a procedural ambush wrapped in the thin veil of legitimacy. Still, she moved. Jasmine had never been the kind to hide. Her hands moved with quiet precision, tucking away documents, double-checking a file she hadn't opened in months. She dressed simply, as always. Black blazer, crisp shirt, a thin gold pin from her late grandmother, tucked near her collarbone. A small reminder of where she came from and who she refused to become. She didn't text her team, didn't call her legal advisor. She knew better than to bring people into a trap they couldn't see coming. And in her gut, she knew this wasn't just about her career. It was about her presence, her refusal to sit quietly, to play the part they'd written for her. As the car pulled into Judiciary Square, she noticed it, the overpresence of press fans. Not the local kind. These were national outlets. Big lenses, suits and umbrellas, too many cameras for a simple procedural review. And then it clicked. This wasn't just legal, it was theater. And she was meant to be the opening act for her own dismantling. Inside, the courthouse felt colder than it should. Not by thermostat, but by intention. Faces she didn't recognize lined the hallway. Suited men with stern jaws. Clerks who looked everywhere but at her. And when she reached the check-in desk, the woman behind the glass didn't even make eye contact, just slid her a badge and muttered, "Room 402. No one said what the hearing was for. No one said who would preside. No one said why. But the air carried a truth louder than words. Jasmine Crockett was about to be put on trial. Not for something she did, but for who she was becoming. And they wanted to stop that before the country caught on. And still, something kept tugging at the edge of her mind. A name. A whisper. Something she hadn't yet seen, but would never forget once it arrived. Because what awaited behind the chamber doors wasn't just a judge. It was a signal that this day, this hearing, was about much more than legal precedent. It was about who gets to speak and who gets silenced when the truth starts sounding too much like change. And Jasmine Crockett, she didn't come to be silenced. When the heavy oak doors to room 402 creaked open, the temperature in the courthouse seemed to drop another 5 degrees. Jasmine stepped inside, shoulders straight, gaze steady, every movement controlled. Not out of fear, but defiance. The gallery was full. Rows of observers in polished shoes and tailored suits, some with clipboards, others with cameras disguised as notepads. Senators' aides, judiciary staffers, reporters from networks that had ignored her bills for years were suddenly front row, eyes wide like they'd been promised a scandal worth filming. But Jasmine didn't scan for them. She scanned the bench, and that's when everything stilled. Sitting in the presiding seat, elevated above the room in polished mahogany, was Justice Brett Kavanaugh. The breath left Jasmine's body, not in shock, but in calculation. This wasn't protocol. It wasn't even close. Kavanaugh, a sitting Supreme Court justice, had no jurisdiction in this venue. The Court of Appeals didn't answer to him. He wasn't assigned to this circuit, wasn't listed on any rotation, and had no procedural authority in oversight hearings involving members of Congress. His presence wasn't just irregular, it was a violation, a breach of both judicial ethics and constitutional distance. But there he was, robed, centered, smug. He didn't look up right away. He was too busy flipping through a single, leather-bound folder with the slow leisure of someone who wanted you to know he wasn't in a rush, because he already knew how this story ended. When he finally did lift his head, his eyes locked onto Jasmine with the sharp disinterest of a man peering down at a case file, not a human being. The room didn't breathe. The reporters scribbled faster. Even the marble walls seemed to brace themselves. Kavanaugh's voice broke the silence. "This hearing will now come to order," he said flatly, as if the phrase itself had authority where his presence did not. Jasmine didn't speak. Not yet. She studied him, not like a subject studying a king, but like a woman who had seen this performance before. Because that's what it was. Performance. Every robe, every gavel strike, every procedural gesture was a theater of power. And he was here to put on a show, not for the law, but for the narrative. From the first second it was clear. This wasn't a hearing. It was an execution dressed up in legality. Her attorney stood to object, one of the most seasoned constitutional litigators in D.C., but he didn't even get through his opening sentence. Kavanaugh lifted a single hand and sliced the air. "We don't need rehearsed defenses here," he snapped, loud enough for the press to catch. "This isn't a debate club." The room tensed. Jasmine's counsel froze, stunned not by the tone, but by the brazenness. It wasn't a legal objection. It was a silencing, and it was deliberate. Then came the pivot. Kavanaugh turned his full attention to Jasmine, not as a jurist examining a witness, but as a man asserting dominance over a woman whose presence offended him. "You," he said, voice calm and cold, "you are a dangerous cocktail. Political ambition, low ethics, and confidence entirely unearned." Gasps didn't erupt, but the silence turned electric. Everyone knew this wasn't standard language. It wasn't even judicial. It was personal degradation in a courtroom robe. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't need to, because now the world was watching, not just her, but him. And they weren't going to forget what they saw when a Supreme Court justice chose ego over ethics and turned the gavel into a weapon. She sat tall. The insult slid past her skin, but not her memory, and silently she began to count. Not the insults, but the seconds. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't raise her hand. She didn't shift in her seat or reach for her notes. She simply sat, spine tall, jaw firm, breath steady, as the echo of Kavanaugh's words dissolved into the marble around them, a dangerous cocktail. Low ethics, confidence unearned. The insults hung heavy in the air, as if daring her to react, to lose composure, to confirm the stereotype they had come expecting. But Jasmine Crockett had learned long ago that silence could be sharper than a scream, and in that moment, hers cut deeper than any rebuttal ever could. The courtroom wasn't used to this kind of stillness. Not from defendants, not from women, certainly not from black women. The cameras were still rolling, the reporters still scribbling. But something had shifted. The performance was starting to slip. Kavanaugh leaned back as if expecting a rebuttal he could interrupt, but Jasmine didn't give him that satisfaction. She kept her eyes forward, shoulders square. Not in deference, but in defiance. In that silence, her memory wandered, back to the cracked sidewalk of a Houston street, 17 years old, walking home from a debate tournament with a hoodie pulled up against the cold. A patrol car had rolled up slowly beside her. She hadn't been afraid at first. She was used to being watched. But when the officer stepped out and told her, "Don't look at me like you have rights," she knew the rules had shifted. The next thing she remembered was the sting of concrete against her cheek, the taste of blood, and the weight of a knee pressed into her back. She hadn't cried. She had counted the cracks in the pavement, one by one, like tiny fault lines running through the story of who got to belong in America and who didn't. That moment had built her, not broken her, just like this one would. Kavanaugh's voice came again, softer this time, but no less venomous. "Individuals like you," he said slowly, "should never be anywhere near power." The emphasis wasn't legal. It wasn't procedural. It was personal. Individuals like you. The courtroom may not have said the word, but everyone could hear it, feel it, wrapped around every syllable. Black, woman, outspoken, unbending. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She'd heard it before, on street corners, in law school seminars, on congressional floors. The tone was always the same, not afraid of her actions, afraid of her presence, afraid of what it meant when someone who looked like her didn't ask for permission to exist in places they weren't built for. She didn't lift a finger when Kavanaugh reached for a folder, didn't even blink when he pulled out a sheet of paper and signed it with slow, deliberate strokes. His eyes never met hers. He didn't need to. He thought this was the end. "This court hereby issues a 5-year suspension from all governmental duties," he declared, as if he were reading a weather forecast, not a woman's life. "Effective immediately, you are further prohibited from seeking public office during the duration of the sanction." No precedent cited, no debate, no explanation, just power wielded like a hammer. Still, Jasmine didn't speak. Not yet, because this wasn't the end of her voice. It was the beginning of their exposure. They didn't see it then, not the judge, not the cameras, not even the people watching from their living rooms. But something was already rising behind her silence, a truth waiting to be unsealed, a reckoning they had summoned with their arrogance. The leather envelope felt heavier than it looked. Jasmine hadn't opened it in the car. She'd waited until she was alone again, behind the closed door of a silent office lit only by the early dusk seeping through frosted windows. The world outside was still spinning, but inside this room, time slowed as her fingers traced the seam. It wasn't fear that made her hands pause. It was understanding. Whatever was inside wouldn't just defend her. It would expose something far bigger, something that wasn't meant to see daylight. She peeled back the flap. The scent of old paper and fresh ink rose faintly, mingling with the tension that had wrapped around her since that morning. Inside were several pages, some crisp, others worn with age. The first bore the official seal of the Department of Justice and a header stamped in red. "Confidential. Internal review only." Jasmine inhaled, then turned to the first line. "Undeclared luxury gifts, private charter flights, off-the-record meetings." The list was methodical, cold in its precision. Every entry had dates, locations, even itemized billing codes. The subject line repeated like a drumbeat. Justice Brett Kavanaugh. A $14,000 hunting trip in Montana. A $9,800 resort stay in Aspen, billed through a shell entity registered in Delaware. A $42,000 consulting fee paid to a firm linked to one of the most powerful lobbying networks in the country. Each of these came from individuals or firms with active cases before federal courts. Jasmine didn't need a legal team to explain the implications. This wasn't just unethical, it was disqualifying, and it had been buried. She turned another page, and then she saw it. A wire transfer for $2.7 million, dated September 2016, routed through a Delaware-based nonprofit, and funneled directly into a law firm known for handling confidential settlements. The memo line was vague, special circumstance resolution, but the attached notation spelled it out with chilling clarity. Sexual misconduct claim, settled out of court, sealed by NDA. There was no name listed, just female complainant, age 32, federal vetting process. But the timeline was impossible to miss. This wasn't rumor. This wasn't speculation. This was fact. Papered over, hidden during Kavanaugh's confirmation, and protected by layers of legal armor, meant to keep it from ever being traced. Jasmine leaned back slowly, the envelope still open on her lap like a box of dynamite that had just been armed. Her heart wasn't racing. It was steady, because now she understood. Her suspension hearing wasn't retribution. It was containment. She had gotten too close to something that couldn't afford to be seen. Not just a man in a robe, but the machine that had built the robe around him. Another page revealed internal emails, names, dates, conversations between high-ranking legal staff discussing minimizing visibility and safeguarding the nomination trajectory. There was even a scanned receipt from a private jet company used to fly Kavanaugh to a political donor's estate, 2 weeks before he ruled favorably on a billion-dollar suit involving the same donor's firm. Jasmine stared at the page, not as a lawmaker, not even as a target of that courtroom's wrath, but as a woman who had spent her life defending the overlooked, the shut out, the punished for speaking. This wasn't just a document. It was a mirror. It showed everything wrong with the system, how power protected itself through silence, and how silence could buy anything, even justice. And in that moment, a decision formed. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet and certain. This wasn't about clearing her name anymore. Jasmine sat motionless for a long time, the envelope now resting on the corner of her desk like a live wire no one else could see. The documents inside weren't just evidence, they were revelation. Not the kind that whispered in legal memos or surfaced through closed-door hearings. This was the kind that burned, the kind that rewrote how people understood the institutions they'd been taught to trust since childhood. Supreme Court, Department of Justice, ethics. Words that once stood tall like stone columns now crumbled in her hands, reduced to paper trails and bank transfers, and redacted names that spoke louder in their absence than in their inclusion. She leaned forward slowly, elbows on the table, and pressed her palms to her temples. The weight wasn't physical. It was deeper than that, like something had shifted in the architecture of her own beliefs. She had walked into that courtroom prepared to defend her name, maybe even lose it. But now, that wasn't enough. This wasn't just her story. It was the untold story of the powerful shielding themselves from consequence while pretending the law was blind. It wasn't, and it never had been. The blindfold had only ever been for the public. In another timeline, Jasmine might have stayed quiet, might have gone home, licked her wounds, waited out the suspension, and re-entered politics through the slow grind of re-election and press rehab. But not this time. Not with this. Not when the truth had found her, unasked and undeniable. She turned to the last 2 pages in the envelope. One detailed a coded communication log, judicial aides flagging press activity around the 2016 complaint. Another listed internal discussions on potential compromise scenarios in case the information leaked. That term, compromise, sat like lead in her mouth. It didn't mean negotiation. It meant containment. Sacrifice the small to protect the system, and this time, Jasmine had been marked as the small, the disposable. But what they hadn't accounted for, what they never accounted for, was that Jasmine had never played for survival. She had always played for something else entirely: dignity, truth, and the voices of those who had never been given the microphone. Her mind flashed back to the courtroom, the chill in the air, the way Justice Kavanaugh had refused to look at her when he signed her suspension, the dry finality in his voice. Effective immediately. He hadn't needed evidence. He had power, and that, in his world, was enough. Except now, Jasmine had something more powerful than all of that. She stood and walked slowly to the window. Outside, the rain had stopped. D.C. was beginning to glow under the weight of evening, streetlights flickering on one by one like quiet witnesses. She imagined what might come next. The hearings, the headlines, the backlash, the questions she wouldn't be able to answer, and the ones she couldn't afford to ignore. She thought about the girls who might never know her name, but would walk into rooms like that courtroom one day and wonder why the chairs no longer faced the same direction, why the power dynamics had shifted just enough to make room for them, and maybe they wouldn't know it had started here, in a folder, in a whisper, in a silence held just long enough to become something unshakable. She picked up the envelope one last time, folded the flap carefully, and slid it into her briefcase. She didn't need to look at it again. She already knew every line by heart, and soon so would the world. When Jasmine stepped back into the courtroom the next morning, something had shifted, not just in her but in the room itself. The same high ceilings and polished wood panels were there. The same gallery of reporters, aides, and silent observers sat like statues behind the velvet ropes. But there was a tension now, a quiet dissonance, as if everyone present could feel that something had been set in motion, even if they didn't yet understand what it was. She carried no entourage, no dramatic entrance, just her black briefcase held tightly in her left hand like a tether to what she now knew. She made no eye contact as she walked past the rows of eyes tracking her every step. Even those who had dismissed her yesterday with smirks or skepticism seemed less sure today. Her silence had lasted too long, and silence, when held with intention, can become a threat in itself. Justice Kavanaugh was already seated at the bench, his expression unreadable, but his posture slightly more guarded than the day before. One hand drummed slowly on the edge of the bench, not nervous, but not entirely still either. His authority remained, on paper, but the energy had shifted. Jasmine didn't need to challenge it directly. She only needed to let it tremble on its own. She waited for protocol to be announced, the court to be called into session. Then calmly she stood. "Your Honor," she said, voice steady, clear, and deliberate, "I request to make a final statement for the record to defend my name and my integrity." The courtroom didn't move. Even the shuffling of papers and the quiet breathing of reporters seemed to pause. Jasmine's words didn't rise in volume, but they cut through the space with sharp precision. There was no aggression in her tone, no appeal, just a declaration that the record, the permanent one, deserved to hear her voice. Kavanaugh looked down at his bench. His fingers stopped drumming. For a long moment, he didn't speak. He didn't even look up. Jasmine remained standing, unmoving. Around her, a few reporters lifted their pens. Others froze, their laptops waiting on blinking cursors. The silence stretched, not awkward, not passive, but taut, charged. Then came his reply. "This hearing," he said slowly, "is concluded." His voice didn't carry the same razor edge as before. It lacked finality. It sounded less like a ruling and more like a reflex, as if even he wasn't sure what power he still had to enforce it. But he didn't slam the gavel. He didn't order removal. He simply sat there, eyes fixed on the papers in front of him, as the silence in the courtroom thickened around him. Outside, the live stream counter was climbing. 4.3 million viewers, a number that didn't just represent attention, it represented pressure. Headlines were already populating across screens nationwide. Crockett silenced, Congresswoman barred from testifying. Ethics or ego? Jasmine stayed where she was. The court hadn't granted her permission, but the moment had. And that was the thing Kavanaugh hadn't calculated for. That justice doesn't always move on cue. Sometimes it rises uninvited. Sometimes it arrives in the voice of the very person the system tried to erase. She didn't look at him again. She looked forward, toward the podium. Not a pulpit, not a stage. Just a place where truth, when finally spoken aloud, couldn't be unsaid. And whether or not the court wanted it recorded, she was going to say what needed to be said. Because some statements don't ask for permission. They ask for witnesses, and today she had millions. When Jasmine stepped back into the courtroom the next morning, something had shifted, not just in her, but in the room itself. The same high ceilings and polished wood panels were there. The same gallery of reporters, aides, and silent observers sat like statues behind the velvet ropes. But there was a tension now, a quiet dissonance, as if everyone present could feel that something had been set in motion, even if they didn't yet understand what it was. She carried no entourage, no dramatic entrance, just her black briefcase, held tightly in her left hand like a tether to what she now knew. She made no eye contact as she walked past the rows of eyes tracking her every step. Even those who had dismissed her yesterday with smirks or skepticism seemed less sure today. Her silence had lasted too long, and silence, when held with intention, can become a threat in itself. Justice Kavanaugh was already seated at the bench, his expression unreadable, but his posture slightly more guarded than the day before. One hand drummed slowly on the edge of the bench. Not nervous, but not entirely still either. His authority remained, on paper, but the energy had shifted. Jasmine didn't need to challenge it directly. She only needed to let it tremble on its own. She waited for protocol to be announced, the court to be called into session. Then calmly she stood. "Your Honor," she said, voice steady, clear, and deliberate. "I request to make a final statement for the record to defend my name and my integrity." The courtroom didn't move. Even the shuffling of papers and the quiet breathing of reporters seemed to pause. Jasmine's words didn't rise in volume, but they cut through the space with sharp precision. There was no aggression in her tone, no appeal, just a declaration that the record, the permanent one, deserved to hear her voice. Kavanaugh looked down at his bench. His fingers stopped drumming. For a long moment, he didn't speak. He didn't even look up. Jasmine remained standing, unmoving. Around her, a few reporters lifted their pens. Others froze, their laptops waiting on blinking cursors. The silence stretched, not awkward, not passive, but taut, charged. Then came his reply. "This hearing," he said slowly, "is concluded." His voice didn't carry the same razor edge as before. It lacked finality. It sounded less like a ruling and more like a reflex, as if even he wasn't sure what power he still had to enforce it. But he didn't slam the gavel. He didn't order removal. He simply sat there, eyes fixed on the papers in front of him, as the silence in the courtroom thickened around him. Outside, the live stream counter was climbing. 4.3 million viewers. A number that didn't just represent attention, it represented pressure. Headlines were already populating across screens nationwide. Crockett silenced? Congresswoman barred from testifying. Ethics or ego? Jasmine stayed where she was. The court hadn't granted her permission, but the moment had. And that was the thing Kavanaugh hadn't calculated for. That justice doesn't always move on cue. Sometimes it rises uninvited. Sometimes it arrives in the voice of the very person the system tried to erase. She didn't look at him again. She looked forward, toward the podium. Not a pulpit, not a stage. Just a place where truth, when finally spoken aloud, couldn't be unsaid. And whether or not the court wanted it recorded, she was going to say what needed to be said. Because some statements don't ask for permission. They ask for witnesses. And today she had millions. Jasmine stepped forward, not fast, not hesitant. Each movement carried the calm weight of someone who'd walked through fire, and now returned with water. The briefcase clicked softly as she placed it on the podium, her fingers brushing over the latches before she opened it. No fanfare, no theatrical pause, just a deliberate rhythm. She didn't look up at the press gallery, didn't scan the room for validation. Her focus was locked ahead. She wasn't here to win sympathy. She was here to introduce truth into the record. She pulled out the first sheet of paper. The DOJ seal faced forward, large, unmistakable, and damning in its clarity. Even before she spoke, the document had begun speaking for itself. Reporters leaned forward. Pens returned to paper. The room grew impossibly still. "This," Jasmine began, her voice cool and even, "is a Department of Justice internal memo detailing a pattern of undisclosed financial relationships involving Justice Brett Kavanaugh." No one moved, no one interrupted. The sentence landed not with drama, but with weight, the kind of weight that drags everything around it closer to the ground. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Instead, she laid the first page flat and turned to the next. Private charter flights, 5-star resort stays, Consulting payments routed through shell organizations, she continued, all accepted while presiding over federal cases directly involving those contributors. She listed them plainly one by one. A $14,000 hunting trip hosted by a known energy lobbyist. A $42,000 payment disguised as a strategic policy consultation. Linked to a firm that later received favorable regulatory treatment. Hotel receipts paid by anonymous donors but traced to corporate PACs. Kavanaugh's hand, previously idle, now clenched slightly around the edge of his folder. It was subtle, but the cameras caught it. Jasmine turned to the next page. This is not a single infraction, she said. It's a network, it's a pattern, and it calls into question not just conduct, but character. There was no anger in her voice, no raised tone. She wasn't pleading, she wasn't accusing, she was reading. And in a courtroom built on image and precedent, that made her far more dangerous than any shouting witness. She turned the third page. Her hands never shook. There is also, she said, her tone now tighter, a $2.7 million wire transfer dated September 2016, routed through a Delaware-based nonprofit, ending in the account of a private law firm specializing in confidential settlements. The room reacted as if someone had exhaled after holding their breath too long. Jasmine let the statement hang for a moment. Then, with almost surgical precision, she added, "The memo line reads, Special Circumstance Resolution." The context indicates this was tied to a sexual misconduct complaint filed during the federal vetting process, before the confirmation hearings. Even now, Jasmine didn't raise her voice. The volume stayed steady, but her words were loud enough to rattle the assumptions of everyone who thought robes could shield reputations forever. She placed that page down with care and lifted her gaze, not at the judge, but at the courtroom itself. "What I've presented so far," she said, "is less than a third of what's in this envelope." There were no gasps, just silence, a silence too dense to move through, a silence that said, something has broken and no one knows how to fix it yet. She paused, not for effect, but because some truths deserve breath before being spoken. "This is not political disagreement," she said. "It's judicial deception, and I will not be erased for exposing it." Then she turned the next page. Calm, exact, ready. Because Jasmine Crockett had come not with opinions, but with receipts. Jasmine didn't pause for approval. She didn't need it. Her hands moved with the steadiness of someone who had waited years to be believed, and had finally brought proof so irrefutable, even silence couldn't deny it. She reached into her briefcase once more, this time retrieving a small digital player. She placed it gently on the podium, adjusted the built-in mic toward the bench, and pressed play. A soft click, a low hum, and then a voice filled the courtroom. It wasn't Jasmine's. It was young, female, brittle, yet composed. The kind of voice that had already learned to carry weight carefully, like a tray too full, balanced just to keep from spilling. "He told me that if I took it public, they'd destroy me." The words landed like a thunderclap, quiet but shattering. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't explain. She simply stepped back from the mic and let the voice speak for itself. "He said it wouldn't be the judge who ruined me. It would be the people around him, the ones who protected him." No one moved. Even the stenographer had paused, fingers suspended above her keys, as if recording it would somehow make her complicit. Kavanaugh didn't speak. His face, once carved in restrained disdain, was now locked in studied stillness. But Jasmine watched his hands. Slight tension, a twitch near the thumb. Not fear, not yet, but discomfort. The performance was unraveling. The voice continued. "They said I didn't understand the forces I was playing with. The audio wasn't crisp. It had been recorded off a phone, likely in a stairwell or a parked car, maybe even whispered into a voice memo app in the dead of night. But that made it more real, more damning, because no one rehearses fear." When the recording fell silent, Jasmine let the quiet stretch. She waited, not for applause, not for a ruling, but for the gravity to settle. Then calmly she spoke. "That voice belongs to a former legal intern who served on the federal vetting committee in 2016, she said. She filed a preliminary complaint regarding inappropriate conduct during the confirmation process. Her report was buried. Within 3 weeks, she was dismissed and blacklisted from 2 major firms in D.C. Still, she didn't raise her voice. The facts were enough. They didn't need decoration. They didn't need outrage. They just needed to be said, aloud, finally. Jasmine placed a copy of the intern's redacted affidavit on the podium. It bore the Department of Justice watermark, dated, signed, quietly ignored until now. She didn't look at the judge. Not yet. Instead, she turned slightly facing the gallery, where the cameras had stopped blinking and simply held their gaze, like they too were stunned into attention. She scanned the room slowly. Every person present had come expecting a suspension, a fall from grace, a spectacle. But what they'd gotten was something different, not a rebuttal, a reckoning. Now she turned to Kavanaugh, and only then did she speak directly to him, not as a congresswoman addressing a justice, but as a citizen addressing a man shielded for far too long. "If I'm being suspended for words I spoke into a microphone," she said quietly, "then tell me, Your Honor, do you believe accepting yachts and cash from litigants sitting before you is somehow more ethical?" The room froze. Not a breath, not a cough, just the weight of a question no robe could deflect. Kavanaugh said nothing. He didn't have to, because Jasmine hadn't come to win. She had come to reveal. The silence after Jasmine's final question didn't just hang. It pressed. It curled into the corners of the courtroom like smoke, heavy and slow, until it was impossible to ignore. No one moved. Not the press, not the aides, not the court officers standing near the door. Even the usual mechanical tapping of the stenographer's keys had gone still. It was the kind of silence that didn't ask for order. It demanded response. But the bench stayed quiet. Justice Kavanaugh sat frozen, his eyes fixed on something just past Jasmine's shoulder. Maybe it was the seal on the back wall. Maybe it was nothing at all. His jaw was set, his hands braced against the arms of his chair, as if tightening himself against a blow he hadn't expected but could no longer avoid. And then from the far left side of the chamber, almost unnoticed until that moment, a man rose. He hadn't spoken once during the hearing, hadn't shuffled papers or whispered to colleagues. He was just there, seated near the edge of the panel gallery, still and watchful. But now as he stood, the entire room turned toward him, as if gravity itself had shifted direction. He didn't clear his throat, didn't introduce himself, but every veteran journalist in the room recognized him instantly. Deputy Director Michael Harrow, Senior Ethics Liaison for the Department of Justice. His presence hadn't been announced. His name hadn't appeared on any docket. But he was here, and he was walking out. He didn't offer a glance toward the bench. He didn't need to. Instead, he calmly closed the leather folder in his hands, tucked it under his arm, and stepped down the aisle with a pace that was neither hurried nor hesitant. Every footfall echoed against the marble floor, like punctuation marks in a sentence no one had written, but everyone now understood. When he reached the chamber doors, a court officer stepped aside without being asked. Harrow didn't say a word. He simply left. The door closed behind him with a soft, definitive click. Not a bang, but it landed harder than any gavel ever could. Inside the courtroom, the impact was immediate. Jasmine didn't shift, but she felt it, how the air had changed, how even those who'd come to witness her downfall were now whispering to one another, suddenly unsure of what exactly they were part of. It wasn't just a hearing anymore. It was history rebalancing itself in real time. From the press gallery came a low rustle of movement, phones raised, text messages fired off, headlines already forming in newsrooms across the country. DOJ official walks out of courtroom after Crockett's testimony. Justice Kavanaugh unmoved amid ethics firestorm, but Jasmine stayed rooted. She didn't flinch, not because she wasn't affected, but because the moment wasn't about her anymore. The weight had shifted. For the first time since the start of this ordeal, the spotlight had turned, not just from her, onto him. Kavanaugh didn't move. He sat in the same posture, upright, clenched. But something about him now seemed smaller. His robe, once a symbol of ultimate authority, now looked heavy, ill-fitting, as though he wore it not for the law, but for protection. And for the first time, it was failing him. Across the room, a reporter whispered, "It's over." But Jasmine knew better. It wasn't over. It had just begun. The courtroom door had barely finished closing behind the DOJ official when the tension in the chamber broke. Not with noise, but with movement. A bailiff stepped forward, this time not toward Jasmine, but toward the center aisle, carrying a thin manila folder in both hands. The court clerk, normally a background figure, rose from her seat with a mechanical stillness. She looked nervous, uncertain even, but something about her steps suggested she was following orders written moments before, from someplace higher than this courtroom, higher even than the man still gripping the arms of the bench in front of her. She cleared her throat. "In accordance with judicial review standards," she began, voice taut, "and upon immediate directive from the Office of Government Ethics and the Department of Justice, this court is instructed to acknowledge the following update to the proceedings." There was no movement in the gallery, not a breath, not a cough, just attention, sharpened like glass. The 5-year suspension previously imposed on Representative Jasmine Crockett is hereby vacated, effective retroactively. Some heads turned. Others stayed locked on Jasmine, as if waiting for her reaction. But she gave them none. No sigh, no tilt of the chin. Her stillness held, not defiant, not proud, but rooted. Not because she didn't feel vindicated, because she knew this moment wasn't meant to soothe her, it was meant to correct them. The clerk continued. "This decision is based on the identification of significant procedural irregularities and violations of constitutional protections, including the lack of clear charges, denial of legal counsel participation, and the presence of a presiding authority with no jurisdiction." Every word hit the chamber like drops of ink on parchment, permanent, undeniable. Behind the gallery, some reporters were typing so fast it sounded like rain. Then came the final line. "The court," the clerk said, pausing for a half-second longer than necessary, "extends an official apology for the irregular process by which the original sanction was administered." It wasn't loud. It wasn't emotional. But it was the closest thing to an admission of guilt that Jasmine would ever hear in a federal courtroom. And it was public. Kavanaugh still hadn't spoken, still hadn't moved. Jasmine looked at him, only once, and only briefly. His face remained neutral, but it wasn't unreadable. Beneath the stillness was something else now. Containment. Not control. Containment. Like a man trying to stop water from rushing through cracks he could no longer seal. Jasmine lowered her gaze again, not to retreat, but to return to the work. Because now the burden that had been heaped on her, the label, the disgrace, the suspension, wasn't just lifted. It had been exposed for what it was: fabrication, retaliation, fear wrapped in procedure. The gallery remained silent, but the air vibrated with a new kind of tension, the kind that doesn't erupt, it builds, the kind that comes when a truth once hidden finally finds its way into the open, when the house of cards trembles, not from shouting but from a single quiet correction. She didn't nod, didn't blink back tears, didn't reach for a soundbite, because she wasn't here for redemption. She was here for justice. And justice, when it finally arrives, doesn't ask for applause. It asks what you're going to do next. Justice Kavanaugh had not spoken in over 20 minutes. For a man once known for controlling the tempo of a courtroom, for wielding silence like a scalpel between rulings, his muteness now felt different. Not curated, but cornered. He sat frozen, hands still gripping the carved edges of the bench, his knuckles pale under the pressure. The robe he wore, once draped with authority and ritual, now looked more like armor coming apart at the seams. It no longer commanded respect. It concealed discomfort. Across the courtroom, no one dared speak. Even the shuffling of paper had stopped. The gallery sensed it, that something irreversible had shifted. This wasn't about a verdict anymore. This was about exposure. And Kavanaugh, for all his practiced restraint, was exposed in full view of a nation watching from every screen, every newsroom, every courtroom that had once tried to emulate his poise. But there was no poise left. What remained was posture, and posture couldn't hold back consequence. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't need to. The documents had already spoken. The recording had already reverberated. The DOJ official's quiet exit had already shattered any illusion that this was a normal hearing. It had become a reckoning, and the robe on the bench was no longer a symbol of justice. It was a mask that no longer fit the man beneath it. She watched just for a moment as Kavanaugh's eyes shifted across the room, not quickly, not fearfully, but almost like a man calculating whether escape was still an option. There wasn't one. Not here, not now. Behind her, the gallery remained silent, but something unspoken had emerged. Jasmine could feel it, a change in the room's center of gravity. It no longer revolved around the bench. The robe no longer held power. The truth did. When a court officer stepped forward slowly, as if unsure whether protocol still applied, Kavanaugh didn't react. The officer wasn't delivering anything urgent. He simply placed a folded slip of paper on the edge of the bench and stepped back. Whatever was written on it, Kavanaugh didn't open it. His hand hovered above it briefly, then retreated. For the first time since the hearing began, he looked small. Not physically, not literally, but institutionally, like the weight of everything that had been sealed for years had finally caught up, and the robe could no longer carry it. A journalist at the back whispered, not intending to be heard, "He's done." Another scribbled a line on their notepad but didn't look up again. There was nothing left to analyze, only something to witness. Still, Jasmine didn't stand. Still, she didn't gloat. She remained seated, centered, quiet. The balance of the room had shifted to her, not through force, but through truth made undeniable. She glanced once more at the robe, not the man, because the robe was what the country had trusted. The robe was what the system had hidden behind. And now it was what the country had to reckon with. Because when a robe becomes a mask, it stops representing law and starts protecting lies. And Jasmine Crockett, simply by refusing to flinch, had pulled the mask away for all to see. What came next would belong to more than just her. It would belong to the system that had enabled him, and the people now deciding whether to protect it or finally to rebuild it. The courtroom hadn't moved in several minutes, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The silence wasn't the kind that follows order. It was the kind that follows collapse. Jasmine remained seated, composed, but there was a distinct difference in the way people looked at her now. Yesterday, they'd seen a woman brought in for punishment. Today, they saw a woman who had survived it and carried the receipts back with her. She stood without fanfare. No one asked her to rise, but no one stopped her either. Protocol had surrendered to presence. Slowly, Jasmine walked to the podium again, carrying a slim folder. This time not leather-bound or sealed with official stamps. It wasn't evidence. It was something else entirely. Blueprints. "I'd like to enter 3 proposals into the record," she said, her voice unshaken. "Not as rebuttal, but as repair." The phrasing struck everyone at once. Not revenge. Repair. Her tone wasn't accusatory. It was clear, deliberate, like a surgeon prepping to operate, not to wound, but to heal something that had long been infected. She opened the folder and removed 3 sheets of paper, each printed in clean black type. No footnotes, no legal jargon. She laid them out on the podium, facing the gallery, not the bench. These weren't written for the judge. They were written for the country. The first one, she said, is a motion for the creation of an independent judicial ethics commission, fully detached from the executive branch, with the power to investigate, audit, and recommend disciplinary actions without needing the approval of sitting judges. The courtroom didn't gasp, but it shifted. Ears perked. Pens hit paper. A ripple of awareness passed from row to row. For decades, justices had policed themselves. It had become an open secret, quiet immunity dressed in the illusion of honor. Jasmine's proposal didn't call for reform. It called for oversight that didn't ask permission. The second, she continued, calls for mandatory quarterly disclosure of all gifts, trips, consulting payments, and financial relationships exceeding $1,000, audited publicly with criminal penalties for concealment. This time the room did react. Several aides whispered to their superiors. One reporter visibly turned to a colleague, lips parted in disbelief. Jasmine didn't pause. She didn't soften the blow. She let the discomfort sit. Justice, she said plainly, can't be traded in cigars, scotch, and weekend hunting trips. Then she reached for the third sheet. And finally, she said, absolute whistleblower protection for judicial staff, clerks, researchers, and court-adjacent personnel. Because the truth cannot depend on who's brave enough to lose everything just to tell it. That line landed differently, not as policy, as personal memory. Somewhere near the back of the room, a staffer lowered her gaze, perhaps remembering the recording they'd all heard just hours before. The one Jasmine hadn't shouted over, hadn't explained, just made space for. Now she was putting policy behind it. Jasmine stepped back from the podium, leaving the three proposals in place like pillars rising from the rubble. She didn't turn to the bench. She didn't look for a response. She looked out over the room, the cameras, the aides, the clerks, the ones who had come expecting a breakdown and instead received a blueprint. She had revealed what was broken. Now she was offering a path forward. And the only question left hanging in the air was not whether it was possible, but whether anyone had the courage to follow it. The three proposal sheets hadn't even cooled on the podium before the ripple began. Not in the press gallery, not in the judge's seat, but in the rows of aides and congressional staffers seated along the left side of the chamber. The first to move was a junior legislative assistant, barely 30, no tie, eyes wide. He pulled out his phone, not to record, but to type. Fast. Then another aide leaned over, whispering urgently to a communications director. Within minutes, messages were flying, through back channels across Capitol Hill, into the hands of people who hadn't even watched the hearing live. By sundown, Jasmine Crockett's proposals weren't just ideas. They had a name, the Judicial Transparency and Accountability Act. And within 24 hours, something unprecedented unfolded. Lawmakers began lining up, not to condemn, not to delay, but to co-sponsor. Quietly at first, a name here, a signature there. Some sent word through assistants. Others walked directly into the House clerk's office and said, "Put my name on it. No edits." By the second morning, 40 names had appeared alongside Jasmine's. By that evening, 92. It wasn't party lines that moved them. It was pressure from constituents, from headlines, from history. The moment Jasmine laid those sheets down, she didn't just present legislation, she cut off the oxygen supply to silence. Some lawmakers admitted they hadn't even read the full proposals before signing on. "I didn't need to," one told NPR. "I watched the hearing." That was the reading. Backrooms buzzed. Offices that normally took months to weigh ethics reform now cleared the day's schedule to make room for briefings. Media outlets scrambled to explain what had just happened. Editorial boards across the spectrum, from the Washington Post to the Wall Street Journal, issued op-eds by sunrise. Even cable networks that had once labeled her too loud, too radical, now cycled her face across the screen with headlines like, "Crockett's Law could change everything." But Jasmine didn't celebrate. She didn't hold a press conference. She didn't even update her official social media. Instead, she went back to her office, closed the door, and read every word of the legislation again, line by line, margin to margin, not to perfect it, but to remind herself what this fight had cost. Not just for her, for every clerk who'd whispered and never been heard, for every staffer who'd seen misconduct and been told to keep quiet or lose everything, for the intern whose voice now echoed in federal archives, no longer buried, no longer disbelieved. When her chief of staff knocked, Jasmine simply said, "Let it speak for itself." And it did, because Crockett's Law wasn't framed in political language. It wasn't about party loyalty. It wasn't about right or left. It was about up and down, power and those crushed beneath it. The speed of its support stunned even veteran legislators. One former Senate Majority Leader remarked, "I haven't seen this kind of bipartisan unity on ethics since Watergate. And even then, it took months. This took hours." But Jasmine didn't flinch under the spotlight. She didn't bend beneath the praise. She knew better than anyone. The moment was fragile. If it became about her, the system would survive. But if it stayed about the truth, maybe, just maybe, it would finally begin to change. And so, while the news anchors debated whether this marked the beginning of reform or the end of judicial immunity, Jasmine did what she had always done. She went back to work. Because Crockett's law wasn't born from ambition, it was born from exposure. By the end of the week, Jasmine had done the one thing the system never saw coming. She had redefined what justice looked like without ever raising her voice. Her name was now etched into congressional records beside a bill that was gaining momentum faster than any ethics reform in recent memory. But as others debated her impact on cable panels and political roundtables, Jasmine herself remained unusually still. Not because she was afraid, not because she was overwhelmed, but because she understood something no headline ever could. Justice was never about the robe. It had always been about who the robe protected and who it left exposed. She watched the news coverage from her office one night, alone. The footage replayed the moment she laid those 3 pages on the podium. Analysts called it a turning point, a revolution, a disruption in the ceremonial machinery of American law. But Jasmine knew better. This wasn't a revolution. It was a correction, a long overdue adjustment to a system that had grown too comfortable with its own rituals, too shielded by its traditions to see how far it had drifted from the people it claimed to serve. The robe had become a costume, and Jasmine had pulled back the curtain. Outside her building, notes had begun to appear. Not grand gestures, just quiet slips of paper folded on courthouse steps. Some were quotes from her testimony. Others were simple phrases. Let her speak. Justice is earned, not worn. Finally. It wasn't a movement with a logo or slogan. It was a murmur rising, slow but undeniable. She received letters from whistleblowers, handwritten, anonymous, typed and unsigned. Some had seen financial abuse inside state courts. Others described harassment silenced by hierarchy. Most ended with the same line. I didn't think anyone would ever say it out loud. Jasmine didn't respond. She read everyone, carefully, and stored them in a locked drawer. Not to forget, but to remember who she was still standing for. She thought often of the intern whose voice had filled the courtroom, that trembling recording, the voice that had cracked open something sacred and rotten all at once. The system had tried to erase her story, to edit her out of the official memory. But Jasmine had turned her into policy, into protection. That was justice. Not a robe, not a ruling, but a future where truth didn't have to be whispered in stairwells to be believed. As the days passed, even the courts began to shift. Judges who had once dismissed ethics inquiries with boilerplate language now found themselves facing FOIA requests from local reporters. Law professors rewrote syllabi to include Crockett's law in case studies. In the hallways of Congress, younger aides now carried themselves differently when entering rooms once designed to intimidate them. They had seen what happened when someone refused to yield and had lived to legislate. And Kavanaugh? He hadn't resigned, not yet. But his silence had grown louder than any denial. The robe no longer cast a shadow. It cast suspicion. And where once there had been reverence, there was now restraint, measured, quiet distance, even from his colleagues. But Jasmine never asked for his resignation. She never demanded his apology. Because for her, justice wasn't about personal revenge. It was about dismantling the scaffolding that made injustice possible in the first place. And so she walked through those halls not like a woman who had won, but like a woman who had refused to be erased. Not once, not by shame, not by power, not by tradition. She had proven something simple, something dangerous, something enduring. That justice isn't worn, it's lived. The headlines were relentless. Every major outlet ran wall-to-wall coverage. Crockett dismantles Kavanaugh's shield. Congresswoman's proposals reshape ethics reform. DOJ walkout sparks federal oversight debate. The story had caught fire in a way few in Washington had seen since Watergate. But as the media raced to frame her as a hero, a crusader, a disruptor of the old guard, Jasmine sat quietly in her district office, away from the spotlight, away from the frenzy, reading stories that somehow missed the point. They talked about her victory, but not her process. They praised her courage, but not the cost. Because what Jasmine had endured wasn't just a hearing, it was a crucible. And what she'd carried into that courtroom wasn't ambition. It was burden. It was memory. It was the silence of those who had never been heard, and the weight of knowing that one misstep, one misphrased sentence, could justify every stereotype, every smear. No reporter had asked her what it felt like to be accused without evidence, to be silenced in front of millions, to be told she didn't belong by a man who had once wept in front of Congress and still been rewarded with lifetime power. No one asked about the nights she stayed awake, replaying old court transcripts in her head, or the hesitation she felt when stepping back into a building that had tried to erase her in the name of decorum. They didn't ask about the phone calls she didn't return, the colleagues who distanced themselves quietly before the hearing, or the donors who withdrew without explanation. They didn't see the isolation that trailed her like a second shadow until the documents emerged, until the truth could no longer be denied. The world only ever sees the fire once it's burning. No one ever asks about the spark. But Jasmine remembered. She remembered sitting in a law school library with flickering lights, studying civil rights cases, while her classmates laughed at her emotional approach. She remembered the judge who once told her she was too passionate for federal work. She remembered the first time she won a case for a teenage mother no one believed, and how even then the victory felt muted, because the system still saw her as an outlier, a fluke, an exception. And now they wanted to crown her. But Jasmine didn't need a crown. She needed reform. She didn't want monuments. She wanted mechanisms, rules that didn't rely on personality or bravery, but on transparency. She didn't want to be the woman remembered for standing alone. She wanted to be the reason no one else would ever have to. So while the country argued over whether Kavanaugh should resign or recuse, Jasmine got back to work. She met with legal scholars, whistleblower organizations, and clerks who had stories but no protection. She asked what safeguards they needed, not what headlines they wanted. She was building something the press couldn't condense into 90 seconds, and maybe they'd miss that. Maybe the cameras would move on. But those who had watched from the sidelines, those who had stayed silent out of fear or exhaustion or disbelief, they saw it. They saw a woman who had refused to fold when the system told her to disappear, and they whispered her name, not as a symbol, but as a signal that the silence was ending and the reckoning wasn't over. The hearing clip surpassed 70 million views in under 5 days. It wasn't just trending, it was imprinting. In classrooms, dorm lounges, senior centers, and barbershops, the footage played on loop. But it wasn't the outburst of a courtroom or the shock of a scandal that kept people watching. It was Jasmine's restraint, her stillness, her clarity. While others would have shouted or snapped, she'd simply read. And what she read had reshaped the story of what justice could look like in America. In Chicago, someone projected her final question onto the side of a federal building in 15-foot-high letters. Do you believe accepting yachts and cash from litigants is somehow more ethical? In Los Angeles, a civil rights group painted a mural of her standing at the podium, eyes calm, fingers resting on the DOJ envelope. Above it, just one word, accountable. But it wasn't just artists who responded. Universities began integrating her testimony into law and public ethics curricula. Professors in Georgetown, Columbia, and Howard revised their fall syllabi to include case study units titled The Crockett Doctrine. One legal scholar called her testimony the Gettysburg Address of Judicial Ethics. In Texas, where she had first been underestimated, a high school in her district quietly replaced a dusty bronze plaque near the auditorium. In its place now stood a single engraved quote, "I wasn't standing in front of him. I was standing behind everyone who had ever been silenced and never had a microphone to answer back." And still, Jasmine said little. No press tour, no TV interviews, no social media threads. She wasn't absent. She was intentional, because she understood the risk of being turned into a monument before the work was finished. Praise, she knew, was a powerful sedative, and she didn't need to be mythologized. She needed to be followed. Still, the impact was undeniable. Law students began forming Crockett circles, study groups focused on reform, ethics, and advocacy in spaces where power had long gone unchecked. One law school dean admitted in an op-ed, "Our students no longer ask how to impress the judge. They ask how to hold the judge accountable." At a town hall in Atlanta, a retired Marine stood to speak during the Q&A. His voice cracked as he said, I fought for this country so someone like her could stand in front of a Supreme Court justice and tell the truth without blinking. There was no applause, just silence, the kind that acknowledges something sacred. Meanwhile, inside Congress, copies of Crockett's law circulated like wildfire. Staffers who had once brushed off judicial reform as too ambitious now cleared their calendars to discuss amendments, logistics, implementation. Even senators who had avoided her in elevators now asked to have a word, usually behind closed doors, usually with a tone that sounded more like confession than collaboration. And in D.C., rumors began swirling about a statue commission, not in a museum, not in a memorial garden, but outside the Rayburn House office building, where the hearing had happened, where the silence had been broken. The idea sparked debate naturally. Was it too soon? Too political? But the conversations missed the point, because the statue wasn't just about Jasmine. It was about what she represented: a shift, a mirror, a refusal, not to scream, not to flee, but to stay in the room, at the mic, in the truth, until the system could no longer look away. From screens to statues, the message had traveled fast. But Jasmine, she was still moving forward, because justice didn't live in metal or marble. It lived in motion. The day Jasmine walked back into the Capitol to file the final amendment to her bill, there were no cameras waiting, no reporters shouting questions, no viral clips being recorded. It was just a Tuesday. Overcast skies, a light wind curling between the columns. But something about the silence felt different, not empty, but intentional. Like the city itself understood that this wasn't the climax. It was the continuation. She passed through security quietly, her ID badge clipped to her coat, her steps steady. A few staffers turned as she walked by. Some nodded. Others simply stepped aside, not because they were afraid of her, but because they respected her. And that, Jasmine had learned, was what power really feared. Not noise, not protest, but clarity. Power fears what it cannot control. And what Jasmine had proven, again and again, was that you couldn't control a woman who refused to play by the script written for her. The final amendment she carried wasn't long. A single paragraph, 34 words designed to close the last loophole in the Judicial Transparency and Accountability Act. It ensured that no sitting federal judge could oversee cases involving known donors, their affiliates, or politically connected shell entities, even if they recused themselves unofficially. No more back-channel influence, no more winks and private dinners in Aspen lodges. This was the final lock on a door she had spent months tearing down. As she entered the clerk's office, she paused just briefly, not to take in the moment, but to acknowledge its weight. Not long ago, she had stood in a courtroom being told she was unethical, unqualified, and dangerous. Now she was rewriting the rules for the people who had once tried to write her off. When she handed the document over, the clerk accepted it without hesitation, stamping it with the date and time. 9:14 a.m. Jasmine nodded, turned, and walked out. No applause, no statements, just motion. Back in her office, she sat at her desk alone. The morning light had shifted across the window blinds, casting thin lines of gold across the floor. She opened her laptop but didn't type. She just sat there, allowing the silence to breathe. It wasn't the same silence as before, not the silence of repression or threat. This one was earned. It was peaceful, because Jasmine had discovered what power feared most: not opposition, not disruption, but truth that stood its ground, not shouted, not spun, just delivered. And when truth refuses to move, power has to. She thought of the young woman from the recording, the one whose voice had cracked across a courtroom and broken something open. She wondered where she was now, what she felt when she saw her truth finally make it into policy. Jasmine hadn't heard from her directly. She didn't expect to, but she hoped she'd seen the headlines, hoped she'd seen the proposal with her story embedded into its bones. Because that was justice too. Not just punishment, but repair. It had taken so many years, so many sleepless nights, so many moments where silence had seemed like the only safe choice. But Jasmine had chosen differently. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't begged. She hadn't run. She had spoken and kept speaking, even when they tried to make her regret it. And now the country wasn't just listening, it was changing. The passage of Crockett's law wasn't marked by a standing ovation. There were no parades, no victory speeches, no choreographed celebrations on the House floor. When the final vote came in, bipartisan, decisive, and decades overdue, it was met with a silence far more profound than any round of applause. In that quiet, there was recognition, a turning point, the humbling awareness that the rules had changed, and not because the powerful permitted it, but because they'd been made to answer. Jasmine wasn't in the chamber when the vote was finalized. She watched from her office, one hand resting beside the envelope that had started it all. The screen lit up with the tallied names. Dozens of lawmakers who had once scoffed at ethics reform were now aligned behind a piece of legislation they hadn't authored, but couldn't afford to ignore. The shift wasn't just political, it was structural. It was a blueprint carved from fire, built on silence and made undeniable through truth. Outside Capitol Hill, change was already taking root. Judicial clerks now had access to independent reporting systems. Ethics audits began not just with elected officials, but with judges long thought untouchable. And most importantly, the public began to ask better questions. Not what did they get away with, but why were they allowed to in the first place? Law schools updated their orientation materials. Courts revised internal training protocols. Even the American Bar Association issued a statement acknowledging that judicial reverence cannot come at the cost of transparency. Jasmine's words, once labeled defiant, emotional, even dangerous, were now printed in binders used to educate the very institutions that once tried to silence her. She hadn't rewritten the system alone, but she'd done something rarer. She'd made the system rewrite itself. For every staffer who stayed quiet for fear of retribution, for every young woman told to keep it professional while watching misconduct go unpunished, the Crockett Act was more than law. It was proof of life, that the system, when forced to look inward, could still evolve. And as the bill was signed into law, Jasmine didn't smile for the cameras. She wasn't there for the photo op. Instead, she stood at the base of the Capitol steps, not triumphant, but grounded. Around her, the wind moved gently through the columns. She closed her eyes, not to savor the moment, but to commit it to memory. Because systems forget, but people remember. And what Jasmine had done was more than win a fight. She changed the reason someone else won't have to. There was no final speech, no curtain call. Jasmine didn't step into the rotunda for applause or lean into the cameras for a headline. She walked out the same way she had walked in, measured, steady, carrying nothing but her convictions and the echoes of all those who had once been denied a voice. And outside the Capitol, the world kept spinning. Traffic moved, phones buzzed, news tickers scrolled past with breaking updates. But for millions who had witnessed what she had done, something had settled. Something had shifted. In the weeks that followed, law schools engraved her words into stone. Advocacy groups reprinted her policy drafts as templates for other reforms. Judges began citing Crockett's law in public ethics reviews. A few resigned quietly. Others adjusted course without fanfare. But the ripples were real. Something that had once seemed untouchable had finally been touched. And Jasmine? She returned to her community, walked the same streets she had walked long before anyone knew her name. She visited the school where she had once been suspended for asking why her district had fewer polling stations than others. This time she was invited back to speak, but she didn't give a speech. She looked out at the students, some leaning forward, others slouched with the unbothered cool of youth, and asked just one thing. What will you do now? Not in judgment, not as a challenge, but as an invitation. Because Jasmine understood what too few in power ever do, that the real work begins after the headlines fade, that justice is not a moment, but a discipline, and that change isn't carried on the shoulders of the loudest, but in the quiet decisions made by those who choose to act when no one's watching. So now the question isn't what Jasmine Crockett did, it's what we'll do with what she made possible. The system didn't shift because it wanted to. It shifted because one woman stood still long enough for the truth to catch up. And now it's our turn to carry it forward. What will you do now? And perhaps that's the quiet revolution we miss in the noise of headlines and hashtags. Not the rise of one voice, but the awakening of many. Jasmine Crockett's story is not about being louder than the system. It's about being truer than the silence it depends on. She did not fight to be a symbol, but to remind us that truth, when held with courage, becomes contagious. That dignity, when defended without apology, can ripple outward into policy, protection, and permanence. She taught us that justice is not the robe, the bench, or even the law. It is the decision to speak when staying silent would be safer. That integrity is not inherited from institutions, but forged in defiance of them. That the real legacy we leave behind is not carved in stone or sealed in legislation, but carried in the choices of those we inspire to speak next. Because in the end, systems only change when ordinary people decide they are no longer willing to let injustice be ordinary. And that is the lesson. Truth doesn't need permission. It just needs someone to stand still long enough to let it be seen. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.